They burned her headquarters at midnight to force her to kneel. The outfit wanted tribute. Harlem held its breath. Stephanie St. Clair didn't mourn the ashes. She counted them, then gave them 5 days to regret it. The outfit didn't come in shouting. They came in after midnight, when Harlem's bravado folds itself into quiet routines. Last cups of coffee, last door locks turned, last stairwell footsteps fading into brownstone sleep. The street lamps did what they always did, laid a thin shine over wet pavement and made every window look like it was holding its breath. Stephanie St. Clair's headquarters was still alive in the way certain rooms stay alive even when the people leave. The air kept the imprint of voices, numbers called under breath, an argument settled without raising volume, a laugh that didn't travel far. Paper had been stacked. Envelopes had been counted twice, then squared again like prayer books. The place wasn't just an office. It was a center of gravity. You didn't walk into Stephanie's world and mistake it for chaos. Not if you knew what you were looking at. The policy culture around her moved like a disciplined current. Runners, bankers, quiet intermediaries. Money flowed, but so did trust, and trust was the only currency that didn't fold under pressure. That's why the message had to be loud. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with something smaller, more humiliating, the smell. A faint chemical bite that didn't belong to coal heat or cigarette smoke. A shift in the air that made a night watchman's stomach tighten before his mind could explain it. A thin ribbon of smoke slipping along the baseboards like it knew the building better than the people did. Then the first lick of flame showed itself, not wild, not accidental. Purposeful. Like a hand had placed it there and stepped back to watch. In the street, someone saw the glow bloom behind a window and did what Harlem always did in a crisis. They looked both ways before they moved. They didn't scream first. They listened first. They tried to hear whether this was a random fire, or a statement. Because fires in Harlem could be accidents. But this one had posture. It climbed the curtains with appetite. It found the papers. It went for the ledgers like it recognized them. Flames pulled at the corners of the room the way debt collectors pull at a man's dignity, patient, inevitable, cruel. The glass in the windows began to tremble. The heat pressed out through the frames and turned the night into a furnace. People came running, not heroes, not cowards. Just neighbors, workers, policy men, women with shawls pulled tight, men with shirts half-buttoned. The street filled in increments, like a crowd assembling for a verdict. Buckets appeared. Someone dragged a hose that didn't reach far enough. Someone else shouted for the fire department and already knew the delay before the sirens even started. A few faces lingered at the edge of the light, watching rather than helping, as if they were waiting to see who would claim the moment. And then Stephanie St. Clair arrived. Not in panic. Not in spectacle. She came as if she'd been expected, and in a way she had. A woman like her was always expected when power shifted. She stood at the curb, the flames painting hard highlights along her cheekbones, smoke curling above her like a crown she didn't ask for. The crowd instinctively made space, not because she demanded it but because the neighborhood understood the difference between a person and a presence. Her eyes didn't dart. They measured. She didn't rush forward to snatch papers from the fire. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't plead with anyone. She watched the blaze the way a banker watches a bad ledger. Not with emotion but with calculation. What's lost, what can be recovered, what must be replaced, and who is responsible. Somewhere behind her, a man spoke the name everyone was thinking but no one wanted to own out loud. The outfit. Not Harlem. Not local beef. Not a petty dispute that could be settled with an apology and a folded bill. This was organized insult. An attempt to step on her neck in public, to make her system look fragile, to make her people wonder if their loyalty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Protection. That word always arrived dressed like a favor. But it meant one thing in every language: tribute. It meant you pay so you can keep your own air. It meant you bow so you can stand. The flames crackled. The building groaned. And the crowd waited for Stephanie to do something dramatic, something loud enough to match the fire. She didn't. She turned slightly, letting the heat wash over her coat without flinching. Her voice, when it came, didn't travel far. It didn't need to. The people closest leaned in, not because she was quiet but because she made quiet feel like gravity. "Everybody who works for me," she said, calm as a locked door, "go home." A few of them protested. Instinct. Emotion. Loyalty trying to prove itself. Stephanie looked at them, steady, almost gentle, and the protest died on the spot. Because she wasn't dismissing them. She was protecting them. Not from the fire. From what the fire was inviting. She let the building burn long enough for everyone to understand the message had been received. Then she asked one question, the kind that turns a crowd into a map. Who saw who? No accusation. No rage. Just the first brick of a response being laid in her mind, cold, clean, permanent. The sirens finally approached, late and wailing like regret. Water would come. Ash would settle. Reporters would circle. Police would ask questions they already thought they knew the answers to. But Stephanie St. Clair stayed where she was, watching the last clean edges of her headquarters curl into black. In the glow of the fire, her face didn't say loss. It said, "Now I know what you think I am." And somewhere in the dark beyond the street lamps, the men who ordered this fire believed they had shrunk her. They didn't understand Harlem. They didn't understand restraint. They didn't understand that Stephanie St. Clair didn't rebuild from emotion. She rebuilt from principle. And principle, once insulted, doesn't patch itself small. Harlem ran on numbers the way a body runs on blood, quiet, constant, and fatal if you spill it in the wrong place. In daylight, the neighborhood looked like any other place that learned to survive. Brownstones with tired steps. Storefronts with windows that held more gossip than merchandise. Men leaning in doorways like they owned the air, women moving past them like the air belonged to everyone. Streetcars rattling their metal bones down the avenues. A saxophone somewhere, practicing the same mistake until it became a song. But beneath that ordinary surface, there was a second Harlem, one built from policy slips, pencil marks, folded envelopes, and names said softly enough to keep the police from hearing them and said clearly enough to keep debt from turning into disrespect. That world didn't run itself. It needed rules. It needed accounting. It needed discipline that didn't announce itself. And Stephanie St. Clair, calm as a judge, precise as a banker, kept it from collapsing into greed and panic. Her headquarters hadn't been a hideout. It was an office in the truest sense, a place where chaos was turned into columns, where rumor was filtered into fact, where the week's wagers became the week's payments without anybody needing to bleed for it. That was her power, order. Not the kind that came from shouting men with pistols. The kind that came from a woman who could look at a room full of hungry people and make them behave like they believed in tomorrow. The runners were the arteries. Young men with quick feet and careful eyes, moving through stairwells and sidewalks with slips tucked into pockets and names tucked behind teeth. They didn't swagger. Swagger drew attention. They moved like errands. Like nothing important was happening at all. Collectors came next, older, quieter, carrying the weight of trust. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. In Stephanie's world, a man paid because paying was the only way to remain inside the protection of the community. If you didn't pay, you didn't just lose money. You lost standing. And standing was the only armor Harlem could afford. Then the bankers, men who knew how to sit in a chair and look bored while holding other people's futures in their hands. They counted with care because care kept you alive. They understood that the difference between a system and a racket was paperwork, and Stephanie's operation had more paperwork than most legitimate businesses downtown. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't apologize for it either. Policy was a response to a city that gave Harlem work when it wanted cheap labor, gave Harlem police when it wanted to make a point, and gave Harlem respect only after it had extracted every ounce of dignity it could. The numbers game didn't start as glamour. It started as survival. Coins turned into bills, bills turned into rent, rent turned into heat, heat turned into a little less suffering. And Stephanie sat at the center of that exchange like a woman who understood something the mob never did. If your people are fed, they don't panic. If they don't panic, they don't betray you. That was why her calm mattered. Because panic was expensive. On certain nights, the headquarters would fill with the kind of quiet urgency you only see in places where money is handled by people who can't call a lawyer when it disappears. A door would open. A runner would step in, hat brim low, eyes scanning for trouble out of habit. A small stack of slips would be placed on a desk like an offering. A collector would nod once. No warmth, no cruelty, just recognition that the machine was still turning. Stephanie didn't sit like a queen. Queens made themselves targets. She sat like a clerk with authority, back straight, hands steady, gaze exact. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, people wrote it down not because she demanded it, but because ignoring her felt like stepping in front of a train. Some nights, a dispute would arrive with the money. A runner short. A collector late. A payout that didn't match what was promised in a backroom conversation. These moments could turn violent in other operations. Men shouting, fists, a pistol laid on a table to remind everyone what fear costs. Stephanie didn't do fear like that. She did something more dangerous. She did shame. Not loud shame. Controlled shame. The kind that made a man feel the entire room watching him without anyone staring. The kind that reminded him that a community can exile you without raising a hand. Say it again, she might tell a liar, not with anger, just with patience. And the liar would hear how thin his own story sounded in that silence. That was the moral layer of her control. She didn't need to hurt people to prove she could. She needed them to understand that in her Harlem, respect was the price of entry. Violence was what small men used when they couldn't command a room. And outside that headquarters, the city pressed in. Police raids weren't always about law. Sometimes they were about permission, who was allowed to operate, who had paid, who hadn't, who had made the wrong white man feel embarrassed. Prosecutors sniffed around anything that looked like a headline. Newspapers could turn a whisper into a rope. Stephanie's response was never to hide deeper. It was to tighten the system. To make it cleaner, quieter, harder to crack. To keep faces unknown and roles separated. To make every envelope look like it belonged in somebody's pocket. To make her people understand that loyalty wasn't a romantic word, it was a daily discipline. So when the outfit burned her headquarters, they weren't just burning wood and paper. They were trying to burn the one thing Harlem couldn't afford to lose. The belief that Stephanie St. Clair's world was stable. But Harlem had already watched her at the curb, watching the fire like it was a ledger problem, not a tragedy. The neighborhood had already felt it, the shift in the air. If the outfit expected chaos, they chose the wrong woman. Because Stephanie's power had never been the building. It was the structure behind it. And structures, real ones, don't collapse when you light a match. They didn't call it extortion. Not out loud. They wrapped it in a cleaner word, protection, the way a knife gets wrapped in velvet before it's handed to you. In Harlem, everybody knew what it meant. A tax you didn't vote for, enforced by men who never had to explain themselves. After the fire, the outfit didn't rush the next move. That wasn't their style. Rushed men make mistakes. Confident men let the smoke do the talking, let the neighborhood fill in the blanks, let fear travel faster than any messenger. And fear did travel. It slid under doors. It sat down at kitchen tables. It leaned into backroom conversations and made people lower their voices even when there was no one listening. The question wasn't who did it. The question was what now? Because a burned headquarters wasn't just property damage. It was a signal flare. It said, your walls don't matter. Your system can be reached. Your name can be tested. The outfit wanted Harlem to start bargaining with itself. They sent their pressure the way professionals do, through channels that looked ordinary if you didn't know where to look. A man in a clean suit in a barbershop chair too expensive for the neighborhood. A stranger buying 2 drinks and not touching either one. A polite face at the edge of a club doorway watching who greeted who. Then the first message arrived that mattered. Not a threat screamed in the street. A quiet contact. Someone local enough to be believable, scared enough to be useful. A man Stephanie's people recognized but didn't fully trust. The kind of intermediary who survives by never holding the knife, only carrying the note. He asked to see her. Not in the open. Not at a table where the community could witness the balance of power. Somewhere smaller. A back room. A stairwell landing. A place designed to make a woman feel cornered without anyone technically cornering her. Harlem had 1,000 rooms like that. Thin walls, stale air, the smell of old tobacco and older compromises. Stephanie didn't refuse. Refusing could look like fear. And fear was exactly what the outfit was buying with that fire. So she went, calm, measured, dressed like someone who wasn't arriving to negotiate her existence. 2 of her people stayed close but not close enough to turn it into a parade. No dramatic entourage. No theater. Just presence. The intermediary stood with his hat in his hands like a man holding evidence. He didn't sit. Sitting would have suggested he belonged there. He didn't. He started to speak, then stopped and tried again, like the words were heavy and he hadn't been paid enough to carry them. They say, he finally managed, it's business. Stephanie's eyes stayed on him, steady as a locked door. He continued, quicker now, relieved to be unloading it. They say nobody's immune. Not uptown. Not in Harlem. Not with what's at stake. They say the fire was a conversation starter. A conversation starter. That was the outfit's talent, turning violence into vocabulary. Making destruction feel like policy. And they want what? Stephanie asked. The intermediary swallowed. A percentage. To keep things quiet. Quiet. As if Harlem had ever been quiet. As if the police raids would stop because gangsters suddenly cared about peace. As if the outfit could sell silence when they were the ones setting the neighborhood on fire. Stephanie let the pause stretch. Not to intimidate him. To make him feel every second of what he was participating in. Outside the back room you could hear distant music, some club refusing to let the night die. A car passed, tires hissing on damp pavement. Life going on because life always went on. Stephanie spoke with the same calm she'd used at the curb while her headquarters burned. Tell them no. The intermediary blinked, confused, like he'd expected bargaining. Men like the outfit were used to watching people calculate their survival in real time. They were used to watching shoulders fold. Stephanie's shoulders didn't move. He tried again, softer. Miss St. Clair, they're serious. They're saying it's protection. For you. For them, Stephanie corrected. Not loud. Final. That was the first refusal. But refusals alone didn't win wars. Refusals were sparks. Sparks needed structure behind them or they died. The outfit understood that too, and they pivoted the pressure, away from her and toward the people around her. That was how you broke a leader who couldn't be bullied directly. You made her community question whether she was worth the cost. A runner gets stopped on a corner by police who suddenly know his name. A collector gets followed for 3 blocks by a man who never looks like he's following. A landlord receives a visit from someone offering to help with neighborhood problems, as if the landlord hasn't lived through enough problems already. Not overt. Not clean enough to prosecute. Just constant. A low hum of menace, like a radio left on in the next apartment. And then, because pressure always needs a stage, the newspapers begin to sniff around. Not because they care about Harlem's order, but because scandal sells. A raid here. A headline there. A photograph of men being pushed into a wagon, collars twisted, eyes hard. The outfit didn't need to own the police to use them. They just needed to point the police like a weapon. Stephanie watched it all with the same expression she wore when counting money. Focused, unsentimental, exact. She didn't lash out. She didn't threaten. She didn't chase the outfit into their darkness. She did something colder. She began to organize her response. Not with bullets. With visibility. With loyalty. With the kind of pressure that doesn't leave bruises but leaves men cornered anyway, by reputation, by community, by the simple fact that Harlem's memory is longer than any gangster's patience. The outfit had tried to tax her. What they were really doing was stepping into her ecosystem and assuming it worked like theirs. They assumed fear was the only language. Stephanie St. Clair was about to answer them in a different one. Harlem didn't need a meeting to decide what the fire meant. It decided in the oldest way a neighborhood decides anything. Through faces, through silence, through the small, careful distances people suddenly kept from each other. The next morning, the burned shell of Stephanie St. Clair's headquarters sat there like a public bruise. Charred wood. Wet ash. The stink of smoke that clung to coats and hair and made every breath feel like a reminder. People walked past it slower than they meant to. Not because they were curious, because they were reading it. Like a headline. Like a warning nailed to the street. And Harlem, for all its music and daylight swagger, had a private language for warnings. In the barbershops the talk thinned out. Clippers still buzzed. Razors still scraped. But men stopped finishing sentences. You could feel the weight of an unasked question hovering over every chair. Is Stephanie still safe to stand near? In the clubs, where lights were supposed to make people forget the world, the laughter came a second late. A pianist hit the keys like he didn't want to be noticed. A singer watched the room more than the band. Even the bouncers at the door, the ones who usually carried themselves like kings, kept glancing up the block like they expected a shadow to step out of it. Because the outfit's game wasn't only to threaten Stephanie. It was to make the neighborhood recalculate her. And recalculation is where loyalty goes to die. A runner who used to walk with pride now walked like he was trying to be invisible. A collector who once knocked on doors like he belonged there started sending someone else. A bookmaker, one of the smaller ones, one who lived off Stephanie's stability, began to tell friends he might take a break for a while. Just until things settled. That's how fear works when it's smart. It never demands you betray anyone. It simply offers you a safer way to breathe. Police pressure didn't arrive like a wave. It arrived like steady rain. A patrol car idling too long at the same corner. A uniformed man strolling past the stoop twice in 10 minutes. A plainclothes detective pretending to read a paper while his eyes counted faces. Harlem knew the rhythm of raids. What it also knew, what nobody said out loud, was that raids often came with permission. A phone call downtown. A favor paid. A promise made. And when the outfit leaned on the city leaned back on Harlem. So the trap tightened from both sides. Gangsters behind the curtain, police in front of it. And still, no public word from Stephanie St. Clair. That silence was the strangest part. Other bosses would have flooded the streets with intimidation, made sure everyone saw their anger, their guns, their capacity to retaliate. They'd have tried to win the moment with noise. Stephanie didn't give the moment anything. She let Harlem look at the burnt remains and wonder. She let the outfit believe they had planted doubt. She let the police sniff around like dogs who thought the scent would lead them somewhere. Then she began moving, quietly, through the neighborhood like a woman returning to her own house. Not to reassure people with speeches. To choose where she stood. She appeared in a doorway on Lenox the way sunlight appears, without asking permission. She walked into a back room where men were whispering, and the whispering stopped because now they had to decide in real time what they believed. She sat at a small table in a brownstone parlor with two women who handled money like prayer, and she listened more than she talked, and when she did speak, it was never fear. It was instruction. Not orders barked. Instructions given like facts. Keep your routes the same, she told one runner, and the runner realized she wasn't worried about being followed. She was worried about anyone changing their behavior and revealing themselves. Don't scatter. To another, older and trembling at the edges, she said, you don't owe anybody panic. Not the police. Not them. Harlem heard about these moments the way Harlem heard about everything. Indirectly but accurately. A cousin mentions it to a cousin. A bartender says it to a doorman. A woman at the grocer repeats it like it's not gossip but medicine. Stephanie's calm began to do what the outfit's fire was supposed to do. It began to move the room. Because the community layer of power isn't built on threats. It's built on whether people believe you will still be standing tomorrow. Whether you can keep their rent paid, their children fed, their dignity intact. Whether you can absorb danger without passing it down the line. Then came the public disrespect the outfit wanted most. A rumor, spread deliberately, that Stephanie was finished. That her headquarters was ash and so was her reach. That she'd be forced to pay protection like everybody else, just to keep breathing. It floated through Harlem like smoke that couldn't find a window. And Stephanie answered it the same way she answered everything that mattered. Not with an argument. With presence. She walked into a club at the hour the room was full enough to witness her. She didn't own the stage. She didn't need to. She simply crossed the floor, slow, composed, and greeted people like they belonged to her world, not the other way around. A few men who had been half-leaning toward the outfit side of the equation straightened their backs when she passed, as if their bodies remembered what respect felt like. That was the moral layer too. Stephanie wasn't asking Harlem to be brave for her. She was reminding Harlem that bravery was already inside it. And the trap, the one the outfit had tightened, began to strain not because Stephanie fought it with force, but because she refused to give it what it needed most. A frightened leader, a frightened neighborhood, a frightened story. By the end of the week, Harlem hadn't seen her strike back. But it had seen something more unsettling. It had seen Stephanie St. Clair take a public wound, and wear it like she'd already decided what it would become. The question wasn't whether she would survive. The question was what she would build from the ashes. And anyone who understood Harlem knew, when Stephanie St. Clair rebuilt something, it didn't come back the same. It came back stronger. It opens in the ashes. The burned headquarters is still a public wound, and Harlem is watching to see if her system collapses now that the building is gone. Stephanie doesn't mourn in public. She studies the damage like a ledger problem. What was lost, what can be replaced, and what must be improved. The key point, for her, the headquarters, was never just wood and paper. It was people, routines, and discipline. She stood in front of the charred shell the morning after the fire, alone except for two men who kept their distance. She didn't touch the blackened brick. She didn't sift through the debris looking for salvageable records. She simply looked, the way an architect looks at a foundation before deciding what comes next. People expected her to be angry. She was calculating. By midday the first contacts began. Not loud. Not public. Stephanie moved through Harlem like she was collecting debts that had been owed in silence for years, and in a way she was a contractor who'd once needed help when the banks wouldn't touch him. A landlord who remembered when Stephanie made sure his tenants could pay rent during the worst winter anyone could remember. A supplier who understood discretion better than he understood invoices. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She simply reminded people of the structure that had kept them standing, and asked if they remembered how to build. They did. Materials started arriving in a controlled, almost invisible flow. Lumber didn't come in trucks that announced themselves. It came in pieces, carried by men who looked like they were fixing a stoop, patching a roof, doing the kind of work Harlem did every day to keep itself from falling apart. No parade. No protest. No crowd gathering to watch the defiance unfold. Because Stephanie understood something the outfit didn't. Noise was a target. Silence was camouflage. She refused to give them the chaos they tried to create. Every person who worked for her received the same instruction. Don't change your routes, don't disappear, don't act scared. If you ran numbers yesterday, you run numbers today. If you collected payments on Tuesday, you collect them this Tuesday. The message wasn't we're recovering. The message was, nothing stopped. And Harlem, slowly, carefully, began to believe it. On the second day, a police captain made a point of walking past the site. He stood there long enough to be noticed, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. He was waiting to see panic. Waiting to see Stephanie scramble. She didn't scramble. She walked past him on her way to a meeting 2 blocks over, nodded once, polite, not deferential, and kept moving. The captain watched her go, and in that moment, he understood what the outfit hadn't yet. You can't intimidate someone who refuses to perform fear. By the third day, the rebuild wasn't just replacement. It was evolution. Stephanie redesigned the space as she rebuilt it. The old headquarters had been functional, tight, efficient, built for survival. The new one would be something else. She widened doorways. She separated the waiting area from the work area so people couldn't watch the system operate like it was a show. She positioned desks so money moved forward, not sideways, eliminating bottlenecks and reducing the number of hands that touched anything important. This wasn't sentiment. This was engineering. A banker who'd worked with her for years asked why she was making it bigger when smaller might be safer. Stephanie looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who's almost understanding. Smaller, she said, looks like hiding. The banker nodded. You got it now. This wasn't about safety. It was about message. You tried to reduce me. I expanded. By the fourth day, word had spread beyond Harlem. The outfit heard. The police heard. The newspapers, always circling, always hungry, started asking questions. A few reporters showed up, notebooks ready, hoping for drama. They found construction. Calm, organized, relentless construction. One reporter asked a worker if he was worried about retaliation, if he thought the building might burn again. The worker, a man in his 50s with hands that had built half of Harlem, looked at the reporter like he'd asked a stupid question. You think she didn't think of that? He said and went back to work. Stephanie didn't give interviews. She didn't make statements. She let the work speak. And Harlem's mood began to shift. Runners who'd been walking like ghosts started walking with their shoulders back. Collectors who'd been sending others to knock on doors went back to knocking themselves. The bookmaker who'd talked about taking a break quietly returned to his corner as if he'd never left. Because speed equals confidence. And confidence is contagious. The outfit had expected Stephanie to take weeks, maybe months, to recover. Time enough for doubt to rot her operation from the inside. Time enough for her people to start looking for safer sponsors. But 5 days in, the new headquarters wasn't just standing. It was dominating the block. Stephanie walked through it on the 5th afternoon, not inspecting, not approving. Simply present. The layout was sharper. The lighting was better. The air felt different, controlled, professional, permanent. One of her lieutenants, a man who'd been with her since the beginning, stood beside her and said what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to jinx. They made a mistake. Stephanie didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. They thought a building was power, she said quietly. It never was. She turned to face him, and her voice carried the weight of something that couldn't be burned. The power is the people who come back. That night, runners delivered policy slips the same way they always had. Collectors made their rounds. Bankers counted money in backrooms and front parlors. The system, Stephanie's system, continued like it had never stopped. And the new headquarters stood there, twice as big, a statement carved in brick and discipline. You wanted me to collapse. I upgraded. The outfit could burn a building. But they couldn't burn belief. And Harlem believed again. Not because Stephanie made speeches. Not because she waved guns or threatened revenge. Because she did the one thing fear can't survive. She continued. By the end of the 5th day, the outfit understood what they'd done. They hadn't weakened Stephanie St. Clair. They'd given her a stage to prove what she was made of. And now the entire neighborhood was watching to see what she'd do with it. The new headquarters didn't open like a celebration. It opened like a court decision, quiet, final, and impossible to argue with once the door swung wide. 5 days after the fire, Harlem walked past that address the way people walk past a place they're trying not to stare at. The street looked the same wet shine on the pavement, same stoops holding their usual witnesses, but the building didn't. The building had been reborn with intention. Not patched. Not hidden. Announced. Twice as big wasn't a vanity number. It was a message written in brick and clean lines. You tried to reduce me. I expanded. There was no ribbon. No band. No speech from a doorway. Stephanie St. Clair understood something about power that loud men never learned. Power doesn't beg to be noticed. It just rearranges the room until everyone notices anyway. Inside, the air felt different. Not because it was new, but because it was controlled. The layout was sharper, space for waiting that kept people from clustering into little gossip knots. Desks positioned so money moved forward, not sideways. Sightlines planned so strangers couldn't watch the system work like it was entertainment. Even the lighting carried a kind of discipline, bright enough to discourage hiding, soft enough to keep tempers from sparking. Stephanie didn't call it security. She called it order. And order, in Harlem, was a form of protection the outfit couldn't sell. The first people to step in weren't outsiders. They were the neighborhood's pulse, runners with careful eyes, collectors with quiet posture, women who handled envelopes like they were keeping a family alive. They entered with the same cautious respect you'd bring into a church after a funeral. You don't laugh too loud, you don't ask stupid questions, you don't pretend you don't understand what it costs to keep this place standing. Stephanie was there, not centered like a queen on a throne, but placed where she could see everything without performing for anyone. Coat neat. Hat set. Face calm. She didn't greet people with warmth. She greeted them with clarity. A nod that said, "We continue." And that continuation, the routine returning, hit Harlem harder than any threat. Because the outfit's fire had been designed to create a gap. Pause. A stutter in the machine where fear could crawl in and make people choose safer alliances. But here Stephanie was eliminating the pause entirely. The message wasn't "I survived." The message was, "You failed to interrupt me." A young runner approached her desk, hat in hand, policy slips folded in his pocket. He'd been one of the ones who'd almost disappeared after the fire, scared, uncertain, looking for excuses to step back. Now he stood straighter than he had in days. Stephanie took the slips, reviewed them with the same precision she always had, and handed him his payment without comment. No lecture. No reminder of loyalty. Just the transaction, clean and respectful, the way it had always been. The runner left understanding something he couldn't have explained in words. The system hadn't just survived. It had improved. Outside, the street began to fill with the kind of accidental crowd that isn't accidental at all. Men who claimed they were just passing. Women who happened to need something from the store next door. Club doormen with folded arms, watching like bouncers at the entrance to a new era. Even the skeptics came, especially the skeptics, because a rebuild this fast demanded to be witnessed. Harlem wasn't just watching construction. Harlem was watching who controlled the air. A landlord who'd been considering the outfit's protection offer stood across the street, arms crossed, staring at the new building like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He'd been told Stephanie was finished. He'd been told the smart move was to hedge. But finished women don't rebuild in 5 days. And smart men don't bet against someone who turns a threat into an upgrade. He walked away without making the deal. That happened 3 more times that afternoon, small defections back to Stephanie's side. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just men and women deciding in real time where the real power sat. And then the outfit's real problem walked in. Not a gunman, not a rival crew, but confidence. Confidence returns like a tide. Quiet at first, then unstoppable. People who had been hedging their loyalties now stood straighter. Runners moved again with the old certainty. Collectors knocked again with the old rhythm. A neighborhood that had started to ask, "Is she worth the cost?" began to ask the opposite question. Is anyone else worth trusting? By mid-afternoon, a police patrol car slowed in front of the building. 2 officers inside, one white, one black, stared at the new headquarters like it was evidence of something they couldn't quite charge her with. The white officer said something to his partner. The partner shrugged. They drove on. Because what could they do? Arrest a woman for rebuilding? Raid a place that looked more legitimate than half the businesses downtown? The outfit had tried to make Stephanie a target. Instead, they'd made her visible, and visibility, when it's backed by discipline, becomes legitimacy. Inside, a banker, one of the older men, someone who remembered when Harlem's numbers were run by violent amateurs, sat at his new desk and realized what Stephanie had done. She hadn't just rebuilt faster than anyone expected. She'd rebuilt better. The old headquarters had been a place you went because you had to. The new one was a place you went because it worked. And in Harlem, where nothing worked unless you made it work, that was the rarest form of power. Somewhere, a newspaper man caught wind of it, because journalists love a phoenix and Harlem's fires always made copy. A question started to circulate in ink and whispers. Who burns a woman out and watches her come back bigger? The answer, unspoken but understood, was simple: a fool. Stephanie stood at the center of her rebuilt world, not smiling, not gloating, just present. She watched her people move through the space with the efficiency she designed into it. She watched the neighborhood outside begin to remember what it felt like when power didn't need to shout. One of her lieutenants approached, the same man who'd stood beside her on the 5th day. He looked at her with something close to awe. "They're going to come again," he said quietly. "The outfit. They can't let this stand." Stephanie's eyes didn't leave the room. "Let them come," she said, calm as stone. "Now everyone knows what it costs them." Because that was the trap Stephanie had built without announcing it was a trap. A building that forced the men who threatened her to choose between escalation and humiliation. Burn it again and Harlem would know the enemy by repetition. Desperate, predictable, weak. Leave it alone and Harlem would know the enemy by retreat. Either way, Stephanie won. The outfit had wanted to make her small. They'd wanted her to fold, to beg, to pay tribute like every other operator who didn't have the spine to say no. Instead, they'd given her the perfect stage to show Harlem, and everyone watching Harlem, what happened when you tried to break someone who understood that power wasn't about buildings. It was about what you did when the building burned. Stephanie didn't smile. She didn't need to. She stood in the clean new order of her world and let everyone else feel the shift. The way a room changes when the person who truly owns it stops pretending she doesn't. Outside, the afternoon light stretched long across the street. The crowd began to disperse not because the show was over but because the show had never been a show. It had been a lesson. And Harlem, patient, watching, always learning, had learned it well. They expected her to answer like a man. That was their first mistake. Because the outfit's idea of power was always the same. A door kicked in, a face pressed into fear, a payment made in public so everyone learns the lesson. They burned her headquarters to force a simple choice: submit or keep bleeding. But Stephanie St. Clair didn't give them a moment. She gave them a problem. After the rebuild, the neighborhood could feel the pressure shift. The outfit had thrown its weight into Harlem and found something it didn't understand. A system that didn't rely on panic. A leader who didn't need to raise her voice to fill a room. So they tried the next strategy: what you do when intimidation doesn't land. You look for cracks. Not in the walls. In people. A runner gets stopped twice in 1 week by the same officer with the same polite smile. A collector gets accidentally bumped in a stairwell by a stranger who doesn't apologize. A small-time banker hears a rumor that the outfit is offering better protection, which is just another way of saying, switch sides before you're made to. It's never announced. It's never signed. It's just pressure applied like a thumb on the pulse. The outfit wanted to isolate Stephanie St. Clair from the oxygen that kept her operation alive. Community confidence. And Stephanie understood that oxygen better than anyone. So she didn't hunt them. She didn't send boys into the dark with weapons and instructions. That kind of response creates noise, and noise creates witnesses, and witnesses create headlines, and headlines create prosecutors. The outfit could survive a street war. Harlem couldn't. Instead, Stephanie did what quiet rulers always do when loud men overplay their hand. She made them visible. Visibility is poison to people who live on menace. Men like that require shadows. They require uncertainty. They require the neighborhood to argue with itself about what it saw. If you drag them into the light, into routine, into record, into reputation, their power starts to leak. It began with boundaries. Not shouted. Enforced. A club owner who used to pretend neutrality suddenly understands there are tables where certain men will not be served. A landlord who takes money from everyone is reminded there are buildings in Harlem where everyone does not include outsiders with new demands. A backroom door that once opened for any man with cash stays closed when the wrong name is attached to the knock. No speeches. No announcements. Just doors that stop opening. Then came the papers, not the newspapers yet, but the paperwork that made Stephanie's world resilient. She tightened the flow. She separated roles. She reduced the number of hands touching anything important. She made the system harder to infiltrate and harder to disrupt. And she did something more subtle, something almost cruel in its restraint. She kept it calm. Calm is what tells the neighborhood there is no emergency. And if there's no emergency, then the outfit's threats look like what they are: overreach. The outfit wanted Stephanie to act scared so the community would act scared. They wanted men to whisper, "She's in trouble." They wanted her own people to feel the temptation of a safer sponsor. Instead, Harlem looked at her and saw routine. Saw her walking the same streets at the same hours. Saw the same measured nods, the same steady eyes, the same posture that said, "Nothing has changed except what I allow to change." And that's when Stephanie let the next layer do its work. Reputation. Harlem carried stories the way churches carry hymns. Not written down but repeated until they became law. Stephanie's reputation wasn't built on cruelty. It was built on a rarer thing in a world of men who loved violence: consistency. If you worked with her, you got paid. If you lied to her, you were finished, quietly. If you endangered the community, you were pushed out of it like rot. The outfit couldn't offer that. They could only offer fear dressed as safety. So Stephanie forced the comparison. Without ever naming them, she made it clear what Harlem was choosing between: a tax collected by outsiders who burn buildings to prove a point, or a structure run by someone who rebuilds faster than the fire can spread. And for the first time, the outfit felt something unfamiliar. Not resistance. Not retaliation. Exposure. Because now, every threat they sent into Harlem came back with a cost. Every policeman they nudged too hard started to look like he was working an angle. Every rumor they planted started to sound like desperation. Every offer of protection started to look like what it was: a takeover attempt that Harlem was no longer too scared to recognize. A policy runner, stopped for the third time by the same cop, finally said it out loud. "You working for them or you working for the city?" The cop didn't answer. But his face did. And the runner walked away knowing the outfit's protection was hollow. Because protection that required you to burn someone's business wasn't protection. It was extortion with better marketing. By the end of the second week, the outfit's intermediaries, the men who carried messages, the ones who delivered threats wrapped in politeness, started finding fewer people willing to meet with them. Not because Stephanie told anyone to refuse. Because Harlem had done the math. They still had muscle. But muscle isn't the same as control. Control is when people obey you without being reminded. Stephanie St. Clair didn't break their fingers. She broke their illusion. The illusion that fear was enough. The illusion that Harlem would trade a system that worked for the promise of safety from the same men who'd created the danger. And in the quiet that followed, between club lights and courthouse shadows, between brownstone stairwells and the wet shine of midnight streets, the outfit began to understand the trap they'd stepped into. A woman who wouldn't fight like them, because she didn't need to. Stephanie had turned their violence into a referendum. And Harlem had voted. Not with riots. Not with revenge. But with the slow, deliberate choice to keep standing where they'd always stood, next to the woman who'd proven that power didn't need a gun. It just needed to be worth believing in. Harlem didn't remember people the way newspapers did. Newspapers remembered what could be printed. Names, charges, photographs snapped at the worst angle, the kind of language that made a neighborhood sound like a problem instead of a place. But Harlem remembered something else: who kept the lights on when the city wanted them off. Who kept the rent from swallowing families whole. Who made order out of a world that was designed to stay disordered. That's why the smoke from Stephanie St. Clair's burned headquarters didn't drift away like an ordinary fire. It settled into memory. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into seasons. The rebuilt headquarters stood there, bigger, cleaner, more disciplined, like a scar that refused to be hidden. People didn't talk about it as the place that burned. They talked about it as the place that came back. And when something comes back in Harlem, it changes the rules for everyone watching. The outfit's message had been simple: we can reach you. Stephanie's answer had been quieter, but it lasted longer: you can reach a building. You cannot reach what holds it together. By the time the early 1940s echoes started to show, new pressures, new faces, new kinds of police attention, new ambitions growing teeth, Harlem had already absorbed the lesson. The neighborhood didn't just admire her speed. It admired the restraint beneath it. She never had to turn the street into a battlefield to prove she wasn't afraid. That was her legacy: power that didn't need permission from violence. In the clubs, her name carried a particular weight. Not the weight of a myth. The weight of a standard. When men argued about who truly controlled a room, her name ended arguments, because she had done the rarest thing in that era. She had stayed standing without turning Harlem into collateral damage. In backrooms, where policy slips still found their way into hands, older men began to talk about the fire like it was a turning point in the neighborhood's spine. Not because it was the biggest threat Harlem had ever seen, but because it was the threat that exposed how outsiders misunderstood Harlem's core. They believed fear could buy compliance. Stephanie proved fear could also buy resistance, if the wrong person refused to kneel. The moral layer of it lived in quiet places. In the way a runner learned to carry himself, not like a thief, but like a worker in an economy that existed because the official economy had locked its doors. In the way a woman counting money in a parlor kept her head high, because Stephanie's order had given her something dignity-shaped to hold onto. In the way people looked at protection rackets after that and heard the word for what it was: ownership pretending to be safety. And the community layer, Harlem's loyalty, didn't come from blind devotion. It came from recognition. Stephanie never asked the neighborhood to worship her. She asked it to be disciplined. To remember that survival wasn't only about escaping danger. It was about refusing to let danger rewrite who you were. That's why years later, when younger men with newer reputations started to rise, men who understood street power, men who understood how quickly the city could turn on Harlem, Stephanie's story didn't fade into nostalgia. It hardened into instruction. Because Harlem is full of loud legends. But it protects the quiet ones who built something real. And the rebuilt headquarters, twice as big, became more than an office. It became a landmark of defiance that didn't need a statue. A place that told every ambitious outsider the same truth: there are some neighborhoods you don't conquer with fire. There are some leaders you don't break by making them bleed in public. All you do is teach them what you are, then watch them rebuild around your mistake. Stephanie St. Clair understood that legacy isn't what you claim. Legacy is what remains after the smoke stops being dramatic, after the headlines move on, after the police find a new corner to haunt. Legacy is the way people keep walking because someone proved they could. So Harlem kept walking. Past the address that once burned. Past the corner where fear had tried to set up camp. Past the memory of outsiders who believed they could tax a woman's dignity. And the neighborhood carried forward the quiet conclusion of that winter night. The outfit lit the match to shrink her world. Stephanie St. Clair used the ashes to make it bigger.